The Birth of the United States by Isaac Asimov. The growing anger, resistance, popular anger in the colonies rose steadily in the months after the passage of the Stamp Act. In Virginia, Patrick Henry, who had just been elected a member of the House of Burgesses, largely through the fame he had gathered in the Parson's cause, rose on 29, 1765, to oppose the Stamp Act and to support certain resolutions maintaining the right of Virginia to make laws for itself. Henry did not hesitate to point out what had happened to rulers in the past when they disregarded the rights of the people and brought upon themselves death at the hands of those who could find no legal redress. Solemnly he said, Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III. It sounded as though he were going to threaten the reigning king with assassination or execution, and some of the shocked and appalled burgesses cried out, "Treason! Treason!" But Henry finished his sentence in a different manner altogether, saying, "May profit by their example." In other words, George III might very well learn from the lessons of history how not to be a tyrant, and might then rule beloved by his people. Henry finished ironically, "If this be treason, make the most of it," and walked out of the hall. The House of Burgesses did not pass the resolutions, but they were published in the newspapers for all to see. Even before the Stamp Act was to go into effect, speeches had been translated into action. There were riots in the large cities, government officials were hanged in effigy, resolutions not to use the stamps were taken, and anyone who looked as though he might take the job as stamp agent was threatened and, sometimes, roughed up. Before the occasion came to use the stamps legally, every single American agent had resigned in terror, and many supplies of stamps were destroyed. In the fall of 1765, nearly 1,000 merchants in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia banded together and organized boycotts of British goods in order to punish the British further by reducing even the customs duties. Courts announced plans to close, rather than use the stamps on legal documents. It became a point of patriotism to use home-distilled liquor, homespun clothes, and home-manufactured objects of all kinds, even when they were not as good as those which could be imported. The furor in America was not without its effect in Parliament. 1/5 of the representatives had voted against the Stamp Act in the first place. Many were sincerely opposed to the policy of taxing the colonies without their consent, and others spoke in favor of the Americans as a way of registering their opposition to the king. William Pitt, who was plagued by gout and was in general poor health, supported the American cause vigorously. So did Edmund Burke, who was to become a particularly renowned parliamentarian. Isaac Asimov was most notable in this respect, at least in the American colonies. He was born in Dublin, Ireland, of French parentage, but had fought loyally on the British side against France, and had been wounded in the campaign against Quebec. Defending the Americans in Parliament, he referred to them, emotionally, as Sons of Liberty, and the Americans did not forget. A city in northeastern Pennsylvania, founded in 1769, was named Wilkes Barre in his honor, and in that of John Wilkes, another parliamentary opponent of George III. Barre, Vermont, which was just being founded at this time, is also named for him. The howling opposition to the Stamp Act fostered the rise of still more radical viewpoints among the Americans. In Massachusetts, two men, Samuel Adams and John Adams, they were second cousins, came into prominence. John Adams, the younger of the two, born in Quincy, Massachusetts on October 30, 1735, was a brilliant lawyer, with all the unlovable virtues, and without any capacity for making himself popular. Though a man of strict integrity and rare intelligence, his vanity was his most noticeable characteristic. He wrote scholarly and effective articles against the Stamp Act, but Sam Adams took another route. Samuel Adams, born in Boston on September 27, 1722, was a failure in life. He failed in law, in business, in anything he turned his hand to, until he found his life work in the year of the Stamp Act. It was then he discovered that he was a rabble-rouser and an effective one. He entered politics and made that his whole life, placing himself always on the side of radical action. He was the first American to come out openly for independence. He did not want Great Britain to mend its ways. He wanted it to go away altogether, and it was to that he turned his mind. Not only did Sam Adams organize riots against the Stamp Act, he also founded the so-called Sons of Liberty organization, taking the name from Isaac Barré's phrase. The Sons of Liberty have been idealized in American legend, but in actual fact they were very close in their behavior to what we would call stormtroopers today. They went about threatening anyone who bought stamps or traded with England, and sometimes carried out the threats in terms of wrecking businesses or applying tar and feathers. They harassed stamp collectors and public officials to the point where even the governor was not safe. The house of the Chief Justice of the colony was looted, while that of Thomas Hutchinson, a member of the governor's council, was burned down because he was thought, wrongly, to have approved of the Stamp Act. Nor was James Otis idle. It seemed to him that this was a case for colonial cooperation. On June 8th, he sent out letters to every colony, suggesting that they meet in New York City to decide on common action against the Stamp Act. The response was enthusiastic, and from October 7th to October 25th, 1765, the Stamp Act Congress sat in New York City. 9 colonies were represented by delegates, and the remaining 4 were absent through lack of opportunity to appoint delegates rather than through any lack of sympathy. Prominent among the delegates was John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, born in Talbot County, Maryland, on November 8, 1732. It was he who drew up a declaration, voted by the Congress, to be presented to the King and Parliament, denying the right of any taxation without the consent of the colonial legislatures. By the time November I arrived, and the Stamp Act went into effect, it had already proved a complete fiasco. Nor did the months that followed show any improvement. The unavailing efforts to enforce the act cost far more money than was gathered, so that the net result was expense, not revenue. Then, too, British merchants were beginning to be hurt by the grim American boycott, and by January 17, 1766, were themselves petitioning Parliament for the repeal of the Stamp Act. Parliamentary opponents were becoming more and more firm in their opposition, and Pitt, in particular, made tremendously effective speeches against it and in support of the American viewpoint. Grenville's ministry had ended in disorder in October 1765, and the new Prime Minister, Charles Watson Wentworth, 2nd Marquess of Rockingham, was more disposed to listen to repeal. Benjamin Franklin was in London at the time. He had arrived in Great Britain in December 1764, hoping to persuade the British government to take Pennsylvania out of the reactionary grip of the Penn family, which then owned it as a kind of family estate, and make it a crown colony under the rule of the British government. He arrived in time to speak against the Stamp Act, but when it was passed by Parliament, he felt that it was the law, however unjust, and should therefore be obeyed. For a while this made him extremely unpopular in the colonies. It was virtually the only time in his life that he badly misestimated popular feeling in America, perhaps because he was 3,000 miles away at the time. Quickly recovering, he began to press for the repeal of the Stamp Act. On February 13, 1766, he was questioned on the subject by a parliamentary committee, and spoke eloquently in favor of repeal at just about the time the declaration of the Stamp Act Congress arrived. He detailed the great contributions made by Americans in the recent war, and warned of outright rebellion if Parliament persisted. When Franklin's actions became known in the colonies, he was restored to American favor. Parliament bowed to the inevitable and repealed the Stamp Act. George III signed the repeal on March 18, 1766. When the news arrived in America, there was a hurricane of joy, and every possible expression of loyalty and gratitude to the British government. George III's birthday, 2 months later, was celebrated deliriously, and statues were raised to him. It might have seemed that all was well again, but what few Americans noticed was that although Parliament had repealed the Stamp Act, it had not abandoned the right of taxing the colonies without their consent. It had, in fact, specifically maintained that right on the same day that the repeal had gone through. All Parliament had done was to admit that the Stamp Act was the wrong way of going about the business. They would now look for other ways.